So drive over. Are you a Ruska's guy or a Weichel's guy?
Probably a Weichel's guy, but if we're really going to go there, I'm going to go check stop on the way to Dallas.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So I've got a buddy that's a tour manager, and he was Miranda Lambert's tour manager, Jennifer Nettles. Now he's doing Parker McCullough. And anytime they're touring Texas, he figures out how he gets through West. And he's got, I think there are 12 kolache shops there. He's got a list of 3. So you can go up to 3 different places, but if you go like, well, I want to go to, X, he'll go, nah, it's not as good as Little Czech Bakery or whatever. Yeah. So I agree with you. I take the back way to Fort Worth so I can drive through there. That's good stuff. Well, cool. Thanks for coming over.
Well, thank you so much for having me in the house.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So Brian Nelson, mutual friend of ours, I think sends me a text. It's late at night. We're at the World Oilman's Poker Tournament. Oh, you really need to have this dude on to talk about nukes. And I barely remember the text because maybe I was enjoying the party and texted back, sure, anytime, call me. And you called me. And I felt like we talked for about an hour on the phone as I was driving somewhere, and I wish we would have recorded that. So if
it was only 15 minutes, believe it or not.
Really?
Yeah.
If we can somehow duplicate that,
the magic,
the magic, yeah. I learned more about nukes in that 15 minutes than I think I'd my previous life. So, and we're going to circle back to cars at some point, but level set me nukes. What were we talking about?
Kind of, I'd watched your show a few different times and you guys had danced around the nuclear topic, but you never really had anything, especially on the fuel side. A lot of these governments talk a big game that we're going to launch all this stuff and we're going to, triple our nuclear capacity. And my first question is, where's it going to come from?
Right.
So if we talk about just by the numbers today, the world's consuming 196 million pounds of uranium, but only producing 155 million pounds. And it's been in deficit like that for years. And so we had a lot of above ground supply that was floating around post Fukushima. Some of these mines didn't shut down after Fukushima happened.
Okay.
And Japan had a hard shutdown of 50 plus reactors. And then Germany went from 22 down to 6. And I don't even know, I haven't kept as much close tabs. I don't even know if 6 are even running anymore. I think, it'd be a big deal for them just to restart. I think the 6 are down. They went with this whole energy Vende where they spent $500 billion on solar and their carbon emissions went through the roof versus France. And it's just, solar panels are great for Texas, but I don't know if it's so great for Germany. It doesn't really shine as well. And then wind, a lot of the energy companies kind of bounced off of that. So I think even BP and Shell packed it in.
Yeah.
So everyone's really starting to turn to the nuclear option. And what happened 14 years ago is kind of in the rear view mirror. And just to give you an idea, the United States consumes about 45 million pounds of uranium. A couple of years ago, we didn't even produce 1 million pounds. I don't even think we produced 250,000 pounds. So we're probably on a run rate this year for 25 around 3 to 4 million pounds. And with the existing companies out there, we can get up to 10 million. But we still got to import the rest. And then you hear, these pledges by 2050, we're going to triple our nuclear output.
Right.
And just look at the U.S., we're about 94, 95 gigawatts, and we're going to go up to 300, 400 gigawatts.
Yeah.
I mean, we can't build it as fast as China could, you know?
So we look out, we look out across the world, and you're right. We saw the shift in France. France was, call it, 90% nukes on stuff, and they were talking about wanting to get to 50%, but they've since reversed that.
Yeah.
Germany did shut down. Taiwan's talking about shutting down.
And there's a referendum to bring them back.
And, if I'm sitting there with the Chinese threatening to invade me, I think I want nukes as opposed to having to rely on tankers of LNG. It seems pretty easy that the Chinese could block those tankers.
And from a cost basis, if you get in a real serious situation, I would think those tankers would get very expensive trying to transport back and forth. When it comes to uranium, what's unique about it, it's so easy to store. Whether it's in different forms, whether it's like in fuel rods or if it's just in rock, in ore.
Yeah.
I think when you had oil go negative, part of the reason, like it was with that ETF USO.
Yeah.
And then there was some storage issues here in Texas as well, right? And I had friends say they wanted to put oil in their swimming pool and wait it out.
Yeah, no, we were renting frac tanks to put oil into. Yeah, that was crazy. So, I mean, we basically rent a warehouse and just throw uranium in it, in effect.
Pretty much. Well, a lot of the uranium would be stored at the utility site.
Okay.
But you don't have overcapacity. You could just always add more.
Yeah.
But
is it radioactive? Meaning, do we have to have some sort of shield around it, or
depends on the grade? Like here in South Texas, 0.1, maybe 0.2.
It's like getting an X-ray.
Yeah, it's not very high at all. I've been next to uranium coming out of the ground with a little scintillometer that's, giving you that sound. You don't really have anything to worry about. In the Athabasca Basin in Canada, you can sometimes get grades 20, 30% uranium. If you were a mine worker down there in 6 months, you wouldn't last long.
Okay.
It just really depends on the grade.
Gotcha. So walk me through this. Where are we getting uranium from today? Because you said 145 million pounds?
155 million pounds is being produced today. The number one producer in the world is Kazakhstan.
Okay.
They have 40% of the market. Number two is Canada with 20% of the market. And these are just two companies. So two companies control 60% of the market. And then you have other players out there like Australia, Russia, Uzbekistan, Namibia, the U.S. to a smaller degree. And, aside from that, there's not, and Niger, there's not much else.
Now, okay, so that's who's mining it out of the ground.
Yeah.
You hear when we talk about, and I know nothing about nukes, so these are going to be stupid questions, but you hear when we talk about Iran, their capabilities of upgrading uranium. What do they do to it after it comes out of the ground and before it goes into the nuke plant?
Sure, there's a fuel cycle, and it lasts about 18 to 24 months just to take raw ore and put it in fabricated pellets that would go in a fuel rod system, right? So first you would take the uranium. Here in America, it would wind up at Converdyne, which is owned by Honeywell up in Metropolis, Illinois. And they're going to convert that uranium ore into a gas, which is uranium hexafluoride, UF6. There's two different ways to do it. You can do it wet and you can do it dry. I don't know enough to be able to talk about it in length.
There's a great dirty joke in there, but I've lost my fastball and I can't make it. So anyway.
So after it turns into UF6, now you got to send it to an enricher. You have two different isotopes of uranium, 235 and 238. You spin out the 238 and you have the 235 that's fissile, that's going to create the energy for you. Now, there are three different grades of uranium, really. The typical 1 gigawatt light water reactor or heavy water reactors that you see out there in the world are about 4 to 5% enriched uranium. Not very high. All these new small modular reactors are around 15, 20%. So they call it high assay, low enriched uranium, where the one I was talking about before is just low enriched uranium. And then it's going to go from, and if you want to make weapons grade uranium to make the big bombs, you got to be 90+%. And then start involving stuff like plutonium in it and all kinds of other fun things. But after you enrich it, now it's got to go back to a fabricator. And they're going to turn it into these little fuel pellets about the size of gummy bears.
Okay.
And you might have, 20 or 30, I forget how many pellets go in a rod, but you'd have like 100 rods in a fuel assembly and maybe 3 fuel assemblies that get dropped into water. And then they throw an electrical charge. That uranium gets really hot. It takes that water, turns it into steam, and the steam hits a turbine. And there's your power generation. So on a nuclear power plant, a 1 gigawatt power plant is going to generate about power for about 700,000 homes.
Okay.
And the power that comes out of a uranium gummy bear is about 17,000 cubic feet of natural gas or 1 ton of coal.
Okay.
So it's super high energy density, and you get, good for the amount of energy spent versus the output you get. There's nothing better than uranium, but it's a very tiny space. You've got 2 players that control 60% of the market. So it's like OPEC plus, right? And if you were the prevailing price right now is like $72 spot, $71 spot, right? And the long-term contracts are at $80 floors, and they're typically trading around 120 to 130 ceilings right now.
So the market's going to be short.
Yeah, the market's going to be short, and there's potential there won't be any ceilings.
Okay.
And so at $80 a pound, the total fuel market, if you were just to buy everything at 80 right now, is only $16 billion per year. But it's 9% of total power generation around the world and almost 20% of the United States, 75% of France. And China by 2030 will pass the U.S. in power generation in nuclear. They're building 10 reactors every single year, 10 new. So, they got 40 plus, almost 50 in the pipeline. And they can complete it in 5 years.
How are they doing that? Did they kind of take the French approach of let's just adopt one kind of design, if you will, and just replicate it, and that's why they can do it cheaper?
Exactly.
Is that
standardized?
That's what they did?
Yeah, they standardized, and as they went along, they incrementally built up their capacity and added more.
Okay. So the interesting thing to me is prices send signals, right?
Yeah.
And so if it's worth more in the future, market thinks we're going to be short. Is that a function of limited resource, or is it just a function of economics? And meaning, if you'll pay me 110, I can actually go mine more of this stuff out of the ground. It's just costlier these days than it was 50 years ago or whatever. Or are we actually scarcity? Do we
it's
not
a combination of both.
Okay.
So let's go to the first part and just give you a little history here. So 1979, we had the 3 Mile Island incident, right? And then
nobody died.
Nobody died. Yeah. More people fall off the roofs of homes installing solar panels and die versus any nuclear accident that's ever happened.
Yes.
Which is kind of crazy, right? So post 79, a lot of stuff started shutting down. You saw a lot of big energy get out of the uranium space in the early 80s. And then 86, you had Chernobyl. And that was a nasty one, So post Chernobyl in the 90s, it was a thing called megatons to megawatts. So Russia and the United States were downblending uranium or warheads, and then maybe about 13 to 15 million pounds was hitting the market, maybe even more. But I know at a minimum.
So that eventually got into a nuclear reactor and turned into power?
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
That's probably the best way you can use it, right? You wouldn't want the former.
Yeah, exactly.
So after megatons to megawatts, Kazatomprom came to ascendancy. So from the early 2000s, it was really a nothing company. And by 2016, it was producing 60 million pounds of uranium a year, and all by in situ recovery. So they were drilling for it. And since 2016, they really haven't had any growth. And, you also had in 2011, Fukushima happen. And so Japan went down with almost all they took all the reactors off in short order. And then Germany, did the same. So you had an overhang. Cameco, the second largest producer in the world, shut down MacArthur River from 2018 to 2022. was a 25 million pound a year mine. And they were just buying in the spot market to help balance it because it's cheaper to buy in spot than to produce it.
Okay.
Yeah. So uranium's low was probably about $18 in 2016 in the spot market. And by January of 24, it ran up to 107. And we've had a big pullback and it got down to about 62. And now we're in the low 70s. And that's just happened in the last couple of weeks. And I think a lot of the hesitancy is, fuel buyers in the uranium space. It's kind of interesting. They're not really incentivized on price like you would think, like in the energy space, they would have a trading desk, right? Maybe the biggest players in the business, like a Constellation or a Duke, will have something like that. But everyone else they buy it when they need it. And the people.
Well, it goes into the rate base.
Yeah.
So you mark it up and you earn a return on it, and who cares because the rate payers are paying for it.
Yeah. And there's not an incentive to buy low, sell high.
Right.
In this space,
Well, you know what there is? When you work for a utility, there's no incentive to buy low, sell high. There's also a huge incentive just not to look stupid.
Yeah.
So if you bought on the forward curve thinking it was a good deal and prices dipped below that, and you had to go to the rate payers and say, well, you're paying a little more because we locked it in, you just look stupid.
That's what happened in 2007. Contracts were going off north of $90 back in $07. And then Fukushima happened, and then the contracts fell all the way down to 30.
Yeah.
So some of these guys remember that.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. A lot of incentive, a lot of behavior can be based on, I just don't want to look stupid.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yes.
So bottom line, when you go from 3 Mile Island all the way till now, you've had an underinvestment in the uranium space for about 40 years. And sometimes the price was so low, it was because, there's no justification to go out there and drill and explore for more. Now, the second part of your question was what? Just
it was kind of, if we, I always talk about when I talk about oil with people, because I always use the joke, my mom. When I'm talking to my mom about oil, mom thinks oil is kind of like a balloon, meaning you drill through it, you pop it, and the air comes out and it's gone. And I always say, no, Mom, you're getting 8 to 10% of the oil in place out. It just becomes uneconomic to produce. So if you ask me how much oil is there in the world, I'll always tell you, tell me the price of oil, and then I'll tell you how much we have, because it's almost an inverted pyramid, right?
Yeah.
Or triangle. Low prices, there's only this much oil that's producible. $500 oil, I can produce a lot of oil for you. And so my question was, is uranium like that? Meaning we got a lot of it, and if we get higher prices, we can go find it? Or is it more like the balloon? We pop it, the air's out of the balloon, never to be found again. If that analogy makes some sense.
If there's higher prices, you can go found it, and it's already known in a lot of places. You just need much higher prices to make it economic, right? Like Namibia, there's lots of uranium there. Well, they start using numbers like parts per million and stuff like that.
Right.
That kind of area, you need well over $100 to be profitable.
Got it.
Okay. Those weren't the same numbers a few years ago. People had their PEA as like a preliminary economic assessment. And I'd probably say costing has jumped 40 to 50% in the last 5-6 years. Yeah.
Because in what I would say, oil and gas technology has gotten good, that the cost structure has actually, or the technology's unleashed more. So in effect, you can say it's been cheaper. I don't know if that's actually true, but you're saying on uranium, it just costs more to get it out now. And what is that? Is that just general inflation, or?
Yeah, I have access, I'm lucky, to a couple people who've really been in the game for a long time. And I actually asked him this question last week, a guy named Bill Sheriff, who's done a lot here in the uranium space in the last 40 years. And what he told me was, it's like uranium exploration's in the Stone Age, kind of.
Okay.
We haven't really advanced off 1970s technology because we haven't needed to.
Yeah.
And so, as I told you on the phone, we just drilled to a certain depth, about 800 to 1,000 feet, and we stopped. But now there's starting to be talk, I know in New Mexico, being able to do laterals for the first time, and maybe a depth 3,000 feet. But now there's an economic incentive for that. But the biggest problem, because in the United States, uranium, it's such a depth. Kazakhstan was producing so much, but they were also devaluing their currency so much that, U.S. producers, we produced 40 million pounds of uranium in 1980, and yet, we fell below 1 million pounds. And we're still the world's biggest consumer.
Yeah.
So that drop off really meant a loss of talent. So either they went to the oil industry, went to some mining company, let's say copper, or looking for gold. And if you look at some kind of engineer or geologist who might have been 30 or 40 years old in the early 80s, they're one of three things: a really senior person in the space, they're retired, or they're dead. Yeah. And when I first got into this as an investor back in 2018, 2019, it might have been only 500 professionals in the uranium space across the United States. So it's pretty shocking. And when you look at like the world, if you add up every single uranium exploration company, every single uranium producing company, and add up all their market caps, it's less than the market cap of EOG.
Really?
Yeah. So it's a small little space, and the small talent pool they have, these guys can do well. But in terms of really hitting scale, there's going to have to be other players that come in here, whether it's, funding from the utilities like they used to do. A lot of the mills in the 70s and 80s were funded by the utilities. And then it's just exploration. Like every single oil and gas company that was a major player then was exploring for uranium, whether it was Mobil or Exxon or Phillips or BP or Shell or Total or Getty Oil, Chevron, Texaco, you name it.
Yeah. So we look at the world. We feel like we have more momentum towards nukes, with notable exceptions.
Yeah.
We always joke on the podcast, if we invented nuclear energy today, we'd be saying, we solved it. We're good, And so, I mean, you hear a lot about big tech and looking at nukes, the Microsoft 3 Mile Island restart, all these type situations. So we look out over the next 5 to 10 years, maybe even go out 15, however long you want. Do we see more demand for nukes outside of China building them? Is India building them?
India, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Russia.
Okay.
The list is pretty extensive, and there's a lot of approvals for reactors, Czech Republic and Sweden. You're seeing a huge adoption in Europe. And just this past week, Germany rolled over finally and quit putting the stick in the sprockets of France about like what's clean energy over there.
Yeah.
Because nuclear would never qualify as that as green energy. So now that is, I really do think the next thing to follow is really Germany reversing course all the way and taking like those 6 reactors and lighting them back up again. And there's a weird phenomenon too. So like a 1 gigawatt reactor, we're not even going to get to the SMRs. I'll get to that in a sec, but each reactor will consume about 450 to 500,000 pounds of uranium as they are today. So if you bring on a new reactor, you got to do initial fuel load of 1.5 million pounds. And then it's subsequently 500,000 pounds per year. So we've got 66 or 68 reactors where we poured concrete and they're in the pipeline. So now if you want to look at that and say, let's say just round it up to 70 times 1.5, now you're at $100 million number just on startup, plus the 70 times 500,000, which would be another 35 million pounds per year.
And we're producing, what'd you say, 155 a year, and right now consuming 195?
196.
196.
So where oil's maybe a 1% growth rate?
Yeah.
uranium's at 3% at a base case because we haven't even figured out what the SMR demand's going to be.
Yeah.
Right. So the SMRs get into the game, whether it's Rolls-Royce or NuScale or Oklo, like Chris Wright, our energy secretary, was on the board of Oklo. So if we were to hit or triple versus what we have today, our nuclear power generation by 2040, because there was some stuff saying that it might be leaked out of the White House, we'd have to build 900 plus 300 megawatt reactors within that time. That's only 14 years away.
Yeah.
That's like wartime efforts,
I talked to an investor, and I just don't know if it was confidential or not, so I won't say a name, but they're trying to get a nuke built in Texas. Kind of as we speak. And so it does feel like potentially there's momentum for it. Young people don't seem to be scared by nuclear energy.
No,
as much as previous generations.
Memories are short. The what do you call it? Like belief system of what they're saying. Like you need to be low carbon emissions, no carbon emissions. Good for the planet. I'm all for energy, whether it's oil, natural gas, nuclear, right? Because if you're pro energy, you're really pro human. A lot of times we hear people argue for the environment at the cost of who?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I always say, if you don't start the conversation with, hey, I recognize the lifespan on average doubles once we start burning hydrocarbons versus burning dung and trash in our houses for fuel, then I don't think you're really serious in terms of making the trade-offs. And sure, we all want a cleaner planet. Sure, we should be worried about what is carbon doing up there.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's a trade-off.
Yeah.
And so give me the state of SMRs. I mean, does stuff work in terms of the technology? What are the hurdles? When am I going to do my Back to the Future, have my nuclear reactor on the back of my time vehicle?
I'm not such a pro on the SMRs, but I do know a little bit, right?
Okay.
So what I do know is the way that they're designed, or a lot of the designs, I think there's like 40 or 50 SMR companies who are competing for market share. It's just like when the internet first launched, and you have all these companies like Dr. Coop or Ask Jeeves, some of them use like a gravity technology. See, like the biggest problem with Fukushima is they lost their backup power. And that's what caused the meltdown in the reactor core when they initially took the hit. So one of the designs, they'll just use gravity. You can walk away from it and they'll be able to cool off the reactor. Now, like molten salt and some of these others, you're getting up to 3x the meltdown capacity. They could really rise without anything happening, which is, to my understanding, way above what's necessary. So you've got some headroom.
Yeah.
These SMRs are what you would call modular. People usually think about a big reactor for Houston or for the Metroplex or something like that. Imagine having a 100 megawatt reactor, a 300 megawatt reactor powering Abilene or Lubbock or Midland, that kind of deal. So, and if you have wild growth in an area, you just daisy chain them. And a lot of the plans for reactors that are going in are where reactors are already at. They always used to tell you where's the best place to find a gold mine, right next to an existing gold mine, right? Same thing in the oil business, I would assume, right?
Yeah, best place to find oil and gas in the shadow of a derrick.
Yeah. So these SMRs can be built much quicker than these big reactors. I think Vodal 3 and 4, because of a lot of red tape, we're talking 12, 15 plus years to build these reactors and cost overruns and all this other stuff. And you look at China, they can do it in 5. And what I found really surprising was the last announcement that they did was funding 10 more reactor builds for $27 billion, saying, well, now they're building for $2.7 billion apiece. Yeah, so the cost is going down.
Yeah.
But bringing it back to uranium, uranium is a lot different than natural gas. That it's only about the ore itself is only about 5% of the OPEX of the reactor. So you could have a massive price spike in uranium. Now, the fuel buyers still don't want to pay a dime more than what they're paying now. But in reality, is the end bill to the customer is much less impact than if, you went from $4 to $8 in nat gas.
Yeah. Oh, I got you. So we got 67, you're saying right now, that we've poured
concrete around the world.
Okay.
Yeah, in different phases of development. Usually between 8 to, I've seen for the years I've been following, about 8 to maybe 14 new reactors come online each year. We've had a number of reactors go offline, but if you have 2 reactors, or let's say 400, 500, or 600 megawatts go offline, and the next reactor that comes on is 1.2 gigawatts, it's 1 for 2. So it looks like the reactor count over the last few years is fairly stable. But what you're actually having is more power generation than there's ever been, because these reactors are so much bigger. And so there's 439 operable reactors around the world. And out of that number, 18 of them are operable Japanese reactors that still haven't restarted yet. So the number, is much closer, probably about 420. So now if you look at 420 reactors and bringing back on the 18 Japanese reactors plus another 67 reactors, you got some real growth. And again, we haven't even talked about SMRs,
right,
in terms of trying to factor in what that looks like, which is pretty impossible right now.
And I don't know that it's going to happen, but I've been calling for it. I really do think AI is an existential threat, possibly, to the United States and our way of life. We cannot let the Chinese win this.
Yeah.
We just can't. We can't let the Russians win it, Chinese, any of our adversaries out there. We need to win it. And at the end of the day, AI is smart people and electricity prices to run the data centers. That's it, And so the way to do lots of cheap electricity is at least in some way, shape, or form has to include nuclear in that equation, I think.
It does. But if you're looking at overall power consumption, AI is in a drop in the bucket in terms of growth versus what's already going on. All the headlines are restarting the one failed reactor at 3 Mile Island, right? Or bringing back Palisades in Michigan and potentially bringing back another reactor in Iowa. We're only talking about 3 reactors, and they're much older reactors. We're not talking about like all the new ones that are coming online and how much power they can generate. A single reactor can do 700,000 homes.
Right.
And like that Diet Coke can right there, that's all the uranium you would ever use in your entire life for powering your house and anything that you would use electric.
Yeah, well, I've heard something to the effect of that, and then to get rid of it, put it in a barrel of oil, concrete, throw it down, however far, and we'll never hear from it again.
Well, I think it's Paducah, Kentucky, and I forgot how many Walmarts it is for a storage area. But if you could recycle that, the number that I've seen or been presented, like I haven't validated it, was 700 years worth of power for the United States. Just kind of gives you an idea of how many bombs we made, right? But there's other reactor technologies called like an MOX reactor that's kind of a mixed reactor of uranium and another fuel, and it's just not coming to my mind. It's just recycled fuel. And then TerraPower, they're all about taking spent fuel and using that for power.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a cheap source. But again, everything that I started watching the military channel maybe 8 or 10 years ago. And the one thing that started to hit me that I never thought about before is just logistics. And, ask the Germans how they felt when they hit that Russian winter. Right. And so people say, well, what about thorium, or what about this next new technology? Are you going to shut down a reactor you spent $10 billion on because of a new technology? Or are you going to keep that thing running? Right? And if they do build it with a new technology, okay, great, it works. Now build it at scale. And how long is that going to take you?
Yeah.
So the uranium business is going to be around for quite a while. And in 2019, 2018, when I looked at this as an investment first, the market was only growing about 1%. You had a lot of these reactor shutdowns, and now they're extending every single one of them. And you have the willingness to build new reactors. And like, I think it's in Wisconsin, one of the old reactors, they want to turn into a new SMR. So yeah, there's a lot of movement on this side. But again, it's the logistic piece, and it's what concerns me is the fuel, because the big players like Kazakhstan in Kazatomprom, they have a big decline rate starting after 2030. And they also have a sulfuric acid shortage. So in the West here, we use oxygenated water, right, to melt the uranium out of the sandstone. And over there, it's sulfuric acid. And they have a shortage of it. There's a couple JVs they have, one with Cameco, they have a JV with Orano, they have a JV with Uranium One, they have a JV with one or two of the Chinese big nuclear giants over there, CNNC or CGN. And they're not able to get what they need to get out of it. There's a field called Budenskoye 6 and 7. I think it was supposed to be producing 11.5 million pounds of uranium this year. I think their run rate's around 2 million. So they won't have that acid or what they need until 2027. Well, when you have big producers like that and you kind of time shift a year or two backwards, it means a very big deal in this space. NextGen up in Canada was another mine, about 30 million pounds to come online. Originally anticipated around 27. The thought process is 29. But with the Canadian government, they still are in permitting issues, like all the way. They've got another hearing like February of 26. So they got a CapEx, I think, around 2.2 billion Canadian, and they're going to build a mine in less than 3 years. I mean, it's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
And especially to bring 30 million pounds online. So that's kind of what's happened is the data that a lot of these fuel buyers have had was anticipating all these restarts and greenfield projects coming on time and online like they thought they would. And whether it's legislation or permitting issues or just difficulty just getting stuff up and running, there's a lot of misses in this space.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's interesting. So is there a use for uranium outside of power generation and bombs?
Our Navy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I would kind of put that in both camps.
Yeah.
If you think about it.
But, I think a great use for it would be for oil tankers.
Okay.
Right. But that really hasn't happened yet.
Now, my understanding on why that hasn't happened, because the Navy's been using in the submarines nuclear for how long?
Battleships and the aircraft carriers for a long time. I mean, you're vulnerable when you go into port.
Yeah. Well, and I've heard the reason we're ultimately is they use a higher grade of uranium, and it's okay if we've got a bunch of Navy dudes guarding it, but to the extent you start using that for commercial tankers and somebody gets a hold of it, it can be weaponized pretty quickly.
It's kind of sad because one of my friends in college and my old roommate was a nuke tech on a sub and was on the USS Stennis, and I don't know that answer.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I've got a kid I used to mentor. He was on a AAU basketball team and mentored him. He wound up at the Naval Academy and wound up being a nuclear engineer. Works for Amazon now. Really smart kid. And I say that, and he's 40 and he just got married. So I sound like a total boomer. But
yeah,
I think OJ was the one that told me, because I always say, why can't we just use the reactors on the submarines down the end of the block? And he said, it's because it requires a higher grade of uranium, and that stuff can be dangerous in the wrong hands.
Well, it's a lot of times it's what comes out as spent fuel is what's dangerous. That's where you get your plutonium from.
Okay, so
Right.
that's the stuff that can make the dirty bomb.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and I know very little about it, but I've had some, like, how would you say it, brief cocktail conversations with
Right.
people who do.
Yeah.
And that was the gist that I got. Whether alcohol hazed my memory, I don't know.
Yeah, fair enough. So if we look out into the world and we go, okay, we're short uranium, how do you play this investment wise? Are there mining companies invest in? I know there's is it the Sprott?
So yeah, there's a couple different things. Like the first mechanism that you're bringing up is the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust, right? So that's just for you to express a way that you think the physical price is going to go up. They tag at different ports around places around the world, like at Converdyn or at New Hope over in Canada, where Cameco's at, or in France, where the uranium sits and says, that's ours, that's what we do. And they don't release the uranium back into space. They just hoover it up. And they did a really good job a few years ago of cleaning a lot of this excess uranium up. I think they bought over 40 million pounds. So the physical trust might have about 4.5, closer to $5 billion worth of uranium right now. And I think it's 60 something million pounds they got, which sounds like a huge amount, but our reactor fleet would eat through that in a year and 3 months.
Right.
Right. And that's just the US piece. So outside of that, there's some ETFs like URNM by Sprott, URNJ, which is like the juniors. And then you have URA, which is uranium miners and kind of a little taste of SMRs like Oklo and NuScale are in there. And then there's one called Nukes, which I think is a great ticker symbol, NUKZ. It's got some of the bigger uranium mines, but mostly nuclear technology in it.
Okay.
So you got 4 different ways to play the ETFs. And URA is the largest, and I think their asset base is their assets under management is about $2.5 billion, roughly, somewhere in there. And URNM is a little bit over $1 billion. And URNJ is maybe a couple $100 million. I haven't looked, recently on that. But yet these stocks are highly volatile, or these ETFs, and the underlying stocks themselves are very volatile. In a bull market, you might have 4 or 5, 50% pullbacks. It's like, can you stomach that, right?
Yeah. I'm an oil and gas guy. Nothing.
So from 2000 to 2007, that uranium bull market, like you went from $7 a pound to $136 a pound. Inflation adjusted, that's $90, $190 now. Yeah, that's with government numbers, not like shadow stats saying what the real CPI should be, right? So there's a smattering of larger size equities in the United States. There's Uranium Energy Corporation, there's Encore Energy, there's UR Energy, and Energy Fuels are the big 4. And the uranium's actually found in South Texas, Wyoming, southern Utah, western Colorado, northern part and central part of New Mexico, and northern Arizona is where, and I forget, did I mention Wyoming? Yeah. So
Wyoming,
that's where the majority of the uranium has been discovered so far. And what's really interesting to me is the Pinion mine over with Energy Fuels. They have these breccia pipe formations. Are you familiar with that?
No idea.
Think about like a soda straw, and you've got some kind of hard rock that is kind of like an inverse of like a what do you call it, like a dome in oil and gas, like the old days, right?
Right.
So the uranium is just going to melt through the rock. Like uranium will just naturally, like you talked about seepage in one of your other podcasts, right?
Right.
In the Colorado River, 40 to 60 tons of uranium fall into the Colorado River per year.
Really?
Yeah. It's just natural. Yeah. And so these soda straws will have a collapse feature, and the uranium will sit there and pour in and hit that hard layer of rock, and just over the millions of years, just collect there. And I saw a very, I would call an esoteric Arizona Geological Survey, USGS video. When I first saw it, it had like 30 views. My eyes popped open because they estimated that there might be several thousand breccia pipes north of the Grand Canyon. And given that what the numbers they were talking about, that it could be over 1 billion pounds of uranium there. So that Pinion mine that's operated by Energy Fuels is outside of what the Obama administration locked up in 2012, and then Biden made it a monument in 2013 or 23. But they were finding grades upwards of, let's say 4.5 feet or 4.5 meters, I think meters, of 20% uranium, which is just absolutely lights out. Like the average grade in that area would be 0.6%, which would be about 5 to 6 times higher than anywhere else in the U.S. from an ISR perspective. New Mexico and Utah might be 0.2 to 0.25, 0.3% uranium. And you'll get some little bands of higher, but like they had several different drill cores that were producing 7% plus uranium over a wide distance.
Oh,
so
crazy.
You talk about being very economic. You know, the average grade coming out there is 1.64, and you just put a shaft down and shaft up. CapEx is minimal to be able to get this kind of stuff. So there's other breccia pipes in around there, but the big chunk has been locked up. And, you know, the big hope is, you know, what the Trump administration is going to do in terms of unlocking a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, I've been talking a lot on the podcast because everybody's pissed off that oil's at 50,
Yeah.
you know, or in the 50s. And my point has always been, hey, that's just Trump. He wants low oil prices. We know he wants low oil prices because it's all about November 26, low oil prices, lower inflation.
Mm-hmm.
See, look what I did. And he's going to get that, you know, hook, line, and sinker somehow, whether he's got to bribe the Saudis or whatever. And what we ought to be doing as the energy business is gritting our teeth, knowing that's going to happen, but then asking for stuff. Well, let us go mine for uranium there. You know, let's be entrepreneurial about it because Trump would probably throw Barron in with it. Sure. Yeah. Sorry, Barron, you're going with him. I had to make a deal, you know? I mean, we should be asking, you know, permitting, all that type stuff.
Yeah, New Mexico is another big piece in that. As, you know, in the 50s and 60s, Utah was number 1 and New Mexico was number 2. And they still have vast reserves over there.
Yeah.
But no one's been able to touch anything pretty much.
Yeah, no. And that's what we ought to be asking for. And we shouldn't shy. If you're an oil and gas guy, yes, you got to figure out how to mine uranium. I'm not saying it's easy, but that is a core competency of yours is extraction.
Yeah.
You know, so go figure it out. It's another profit center.
Yeah. And you speak about extraction. Most of the uranium's done by water well rigs.
Okay.
You're not talking bringing Helmerich and Payne out there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, this is cool. So, who do you want a phone call from? If anybody's out there listening, because quite frankly, I don't even know what your job is.
Oh, I sit as an independent director on a uranium exploration company.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. And so kind of as a board member, do you do consulting on the side, stuff like that, or
haven't really thought about it that much? You know, we've been focused on trying to operate and choose the properties that we have and which ones we're going to move on first. We made a recent acquisition in one, and then we got a lot of options, right? So it's what's going to bring the most bang for the buck without diluting our shareholders.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. So being on the board of a company, you want capital providers calling.
Yeah.
always like to chat with them.
It's not necessarily just capital. I mean, you know, I know some people that are fuel buyers in the energy space here, right? For like the major utilities.
Yeah.
And you've had a guest on named Cuppy, and I love one of his comments before. He says, if you're going to panic first, right?
Yeah. Cuppy's great.
Knowing that we've got these big shortages going on, I look at just Texas and ERCOT. Like I just saw something the other day where 52% of our energy is generated from solar in one day or 1 week.
Yeah.
And it's just intermittent. And then, you know, what kind of technology are you going to use to store it? And how long is that going to last? I think a lot of these solar panels are only good for about 20 years, unless there's something new that I'm not aware of. You know, when you look at nuclear, you have 60-year plants that have been extended to 80 years, and some of them are looking at 100 years. Right. You know, so it's stability. And you're talking, I forgot which reactor it was, but, you know, 98.8% uptime.
Yeah.
Right. So It's base load. And that's, you say you're going to win the AI race, you need base load power.
No, that is absolutely right. Because we were talking about that this morning. The ability to turn on the lights when it's cloudy outside or the wind's not blowing is really important.
Yeah.
And so totally agree.
But there's a company in South Texas, headquartered in Corpus, Encore Energy, right? They just had a management change because they were a little bit slow on the production side. And they put in their press release, they're looking for someone from the nat gas space to operate it. So if you're asking me who I would like to talk to, I'd say more people from oil and gas, because there's just not enough people to be able to get up to the numbers that we need to get to be self-sufficient in the United States.
Yeah, no, that's right. And what's interesting is we're seeing that across the whole energy chain. We get called from solar companies, wind companies. Hey man, I need oil and gas folks because they're trained to be engineers. I have land use agreements just like that. And so, that is one of the things I tell young people. I know it's a really volatile industry, but your skills are way more transferable than you realize. So,
and I guess the other group I'd love to hear is anyone that's got minerals that'd be of interest to us.
There you go.
Uranium's a little different. I think in oil, you guys pay a 12% royalty?
It's the shale revolution pushed it to 25%. It's tough to get under a quarter.
We're at 6.
Yeah. There you go. So, but the you need to spin it to the mineral holders. It's way more lucrative, or something.
We just call it bonus money, right?
There you go. That's awesome. Well, Eric, you were cool to come on. This was awesome. I knew none of this. Now when I talk on BDE about nuclear, I only sound 3/4 stupid as opposed to 100% stupid.
Well, I can put you in touch with the people that really know, so if you give you better ammo next time.
I'll figure out some way to mess that up and forget it. But anyway, you're cool to come on.
Oh, I appreciate it, Chuck.